go on holiday, you're going to go on a trip. Here's a suitcase that I recently took on mine. What might you need to pack for the journey? Any offers of suggestions? What might we need for the journey?
Toothbrush.
Toothbrush, good start.
A book.
A book? Good, you're going for the essentials first. Daisy. Pyjamas.
Antiseptic wipes.
Oh gosh, someone's very practical over there. Thinking ahead.
Masks.
Masks, yes, at the moment, masks. I think we could probably fill that up with all sorts of things. I've just been on a holiday to beautiful Cornwall and Devon. And it took John and I, my husband, some time to pack. We absolutely filled not only this, but the boot of our car with all sorts of things that we thought we just might need during our week away. This was stuffed to bursting with clothes for sun and for rain and for wind, and we did have it all. I had 5 pairs of shoes. I had my beach shoes, I had my slippers, I had some sandals, I had a pair of sort of outdoor brown shoes, and I had my walking boots. And then we simply had to take our little travel iron. Has anyone got one of those? It's like about this big. We didn't have a little travel ironing board, but we had the travel iron. And of course I had to have a hairdryer, so that went. We took a laptop. There were 3 phones, 2 chargers. And then someone mentioned books. We had books. Actually, we had a library of books. We had novels. We had an assortment of all these walking guides. We had all sorts of spiritual books for, our growth and edification. And then there was the food. Oh, we had lots of boxes of food. And of course, the dog bed. And last but not least, Rollo would be very pleased to hear this, we had the dog. The dog came to it, and John, of course. No, we don't tend to travel light when we go away. We have, I don't know if you've seen our car, it's got quite a big boot, and we absolutely fill it up. I wonder how you pack when you go away. Do you travel lightly, or are you a bit like John and I, and take everything you can find? In our Gospel reading today, Jesus is out in the villages and he's teaching the good news. And he calls his 12 disciples to him, and then he sends them out to help spread the love of God. And he sends them out in twos so that they will have each other for mutual support, and they won't be on their own, so they go out in twos. That all sounds very wise, doesn't it? But here comes the puzzling bit. He orders them to take nothing with them for the journey. Forget this, they're not to take this. This is all they are to take. That's all they can take, a staff. There we are, a magnificent staff here with a little green man carved into it. I wonder what's this useful for? What do you think this might be useful for the journey?
Wild animals.
Wild animals, yes, or dogs. Yeah. I use mine actually in Cornwall. It's incredibly useful on the hills to sort of support the knees. So he tells them this is what they can take. Forget that suitcase. This is it. And the disciples, they're only to have one set of clothes. Jesus explicitly, in one of the translations of that reading, tells them that they're not to put on 2 tunics. They're only to have the one that they're standing in. And it gets even more puzzling because they're not even to take any food. No food and no bag, no rucksack, no suitcase. And they are to have no money, nothing. But they can wear these. Or some a bit like them. He says that they are to wear a pair of sandals. So he doesn't want them to go barefoot. He doesn't want them to sort of hurt their feet and injure their feet. There is a degree of sort of practical consideration there that they can have just one, not 5 pairs of shoes like I took, just the one pair of sandals. So why would Jesus send his disciples out into the world to do this work of his with so very little? I'd be terrified if I knew that my children were travelling the world and all they had was this and these and no health insurance, nothing. I'd be completely terrified for them. Some commentators think that it teaches the disciples that they are to trust and they are to rely on God. Now I'm sure that must be true. It is the providence of God and it's the kindness of strangers that will provide for them. And in that kindness we will discern, they will discern the love that flows from God. But there is, welcome! But there is another dimension to this as well. Jesus knew that wealth can be a stumbling block for us in the spiritual life, and it can corrupt us. It's much harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, he tells us in the Gospel of Matthew. And he calls his disciples to this radical life of simplicity, where possessions, they're not to be craved and they're not to be pursued. They do not need 2 tunics when 1 tunic is enough. Humans, sadly, we're very prone to greed. And Jesus, by sending his disciples out with very little, apart from the staff, helped them to avoid the temptations of being overly attracted and attached to their wealth and to their possessions. It's really quite extreme, wasn't it? But he was teaching them that the joy of life is to be found in God and not in their ability to make and to spend money and to own lots of things. Now, this commitment to very simple living can be found very powerfully in the Franciscan spiritual tradition. St. Francis came along in the 12th century, and it was a time when the Catholic Church had become very bloated with wealth and with opulence, and the clergy were living quite lavishly. And Francis, he came from a very wealthy Italian family. And his father, he was a cloth merchant, he'd made a lot of money. And all around Francis, there was this growth of a moneyed middle class of merchants. And everyone was obsessed with money. It was the stuff of life. It was what made the world go round. And Francis, he made this radical vow of poverty, and it was like an antidote to all this obsession with money that was in his culture at the time. Because St. Francis saw what harm money and greed could do to the church. It was harming the church and the fabric of society. And there's this lovely story about St. Francis. Apparently he was inspired by the very passage that we're focusing on at this moment, where Jesus was telling his disciples to take nothing for the journey. This was a really important teaching for Francis, and it inspired his ministry. And in a dramatic gesture, he took off all his expensive clothing, and he did this publicly and in front of his Father, and he stood there naked to show him and to show the world that he was leaving all of this wealth behind. So that's one of the kind of popular stories about St. Francis. So what does this little passage in the Gospel mean for us today? To take nothing with us for our journey apart from this and our sandals. What could that possibly say to us today? I don't think it would be wise for us to abandon all our possessions and to empty our bank accounts. Our treasurer might agree with that, possibly. And I don't think it would be wise for us to take off all our clothing in public either. That probably wouldn't be a good idea.
Oh, heaven forbid.
It depends what beach you're on, doesn't it? I think there's one in Brighton to do it. But so we need our clothing, and we need a certain amount of financial security in our contemporary world and the way that we live, so that we are safe and so that we can live well. But the passage does teach us something very profound about what it means to live simply, and not to take or to crave more than we really need. Last week, there's a Christian environmental organisation called Green Christian, and they launched a new course last week. The course is called Plenty. And the aim of the course is to examine the usually unexamined assumption that endless economic growth is essential to our human flourishing, and to begin to imagine that there are other ways for us to live and to flourish together. And this course, it covers Christian responses to sustainability, to consumerism and economics. And I believe that the argument in the course is that our current economic system is too greedy. We're just taking too much, and we're bursting the limits of creation. And we need to be freed from this pressure that we live in to keep consuming and wanting more and more. We can take deep joy in having just enough rather than more than enough. So I'm so glad that this course has been produced, and that Christians are beginning to think about these things and talk about these things together, especially as we are now moving towards COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow in November, when all the world leaders will come together and talk about climate change. So what would it mean for us to travel lightly with our staff and our sandals as we journey in our lives? What would that mean for us to have one tunic rather than 2 or 20? To consider needs versus our wants, and to make decisions about our consumption of goods that are more conscious and are kind of deliberate, and we think them through, and to share what we have equally so that everyone has enough. I think our earth might have a huge sigh of relief, and we might find ourselves liberated from the pressures of a consumer culture that encourages us to always want more than we need and never feel satisfied. And I might find it much quicker and easier to pack for my holiday. Amen.